A minute ago in the previous video I showed you a table that showed you the difference between using who and whom and which and that. But I bet you still have some questions about those, and you're not alone. Who and whom, which and that are some of the most commonly confused and mixed up pronouns in our language. So what I want to do now is take a look at some commonly confused relative pronouns. We'll take a look at who and whom versus which and that. We'll take a look at which versus that specifically, and finally who versus whom specifically. We'll settle that debate once and for all. Let's start with when is it who, when is it which? Always use who or whom when referring to human beings. Never use which or that to refer to a person. As in, we thanked the firefighters who put out the blaze. Or the teacher whom you had last year retired. The man in the yellow hat who cares for Curious George has an apartment in the city and a house in the country, even though he doesn't ever seem to have a job. Anyway, always use which or that when referring to non-human substantives. The castle that we visited was built in the 8th century. My wife's car, which is a Honda, is really fuel efficient. The dog that I rescued has become part of our family. So, what about animals? In that last sentence, you may have noticed that it was about a dog, and I still used that. Well, generally, since it's not a human being, you still use which or that, because animals are not human beings. Yeah, the chimp that climbed the tree nearly fell. We tracked the bear which had ransacked our campsite, that sort of thing. Use who or whom only when deliberately giving animals human qualities, such as in fairy tales or in children's cartoons. My daughter dreamed about Curious George, who is her favorite storybook character, or Yogi Bear, who always steals picnic baskets, gets into mischief with his best pal, Boo Boo. This, by the way, distinguishing when to use who and when to use which, or when to use whom and when to use which, is another SAT-ACT skill, so please mark that. Next up, when is it which and when is it that? Here's a general rule of thumb that will never steer you wrong. Use which when the relative clause is set off with commas. As in, the Scarlet Letter, which was published in 1850, is widely considered to be the first work of American literature, first great work of American literature. Or, we all disliked his performance, comma, which we felt was self-aggrandizing. Use that when the relative clause is not set off with commas. We all read the book that was assigned. The job that he was given took a great deal of time. By the way, we're going to go over when to use commas and when not to use commas in a future lesson. Yeah. This rule of using which with commas and using that without commas is disputed, but if you go by it, you will always be correct. And last, the much anticipated who versus whom. When is it who? When is it whom? Who is the subjective relative pronoun. So whenever you would normally use he, the subjective relative pronoun, you would actually also use who. That's a really good trick. Anytime that you could substitute he in the sentence and it still makes sense, you would use who. For instance here, I know a man who sells watches. I could say he sells watches, and that sounds right, so I know I need to use who. My accountant, who was born in Canada, is always right. He was born in Canada. See how I can just, if I can substitute who for he, then I know that it's correct. Whom is an objective pronoun. It's the objective relative form. So whenever you would use a relative pronoun like him, you would also use whom. He visited the prisoner whom the guards had beaten. We could say him the guards had beaten, or actually in English we'd flip this around and say the guards had beaten him. I saw the doctor whom my co-workers spoke highly of. We could swap out whom with him. Him my co-workers spoke highly of, or we'd flip it around again. My co-workers spoke highly of him. But we know right away that we can't use who here because we wouldn't say my co-workers speak highly of he. Okay, so now we know who is not correct there, it's whom. This is a SAT-ACT skill that you will definitely need to have on those tests, so try getting this little trick down, that use who when you would use he, and use whom where you would use him. All right, just to recap, commonly confused relative pronouns, who, whom versus which, that. Always use who or whom when you're referring to people, and always use which, that when referring not to people. Which versus that. Use which when it comes after a comma. Use that when there are no commas. And again, that's a disputed rule, but if you do it, you will always be correct. You can't possibly be wrong. And finally, who versus whom. Who, think he. Whom, think him. All right. Some of the rules, these rules are not just applicable to relative pronouns. We talked about earlier that the list of relative pronouns overlaps with interrogative pronouns, but you use these same rules with their interrogative form. So if who or whom starts a question, you use the exact same rule to determine which is correct. All right. Now try some exercises that deal with correcting commonly confused pronoun errors.